In this section, we discuss image sampling, which is the very core of V-Ray and any other rendering engine. This is an extremely vast subject to explore, and I'll be trying to do my best not to confuse you and discuss it in a simple and effective way. If loosely defined, image sampling is the process of generating a 2D image out of the information gathered from a 3D scene. Now, what we described is also known as ray tracing. V-Ray, like almost all other render engines, is a ray tracer. If I want to construct a more technical definition of ray tracing, I would say it is the process of tracing rays from the camera for each pixel and calculating the color of that pixel. So if we have the color value for all the pixels, we can simply put those pixels together and produce the final image. Now, let's see how ray tracing works in a bit more visual manner. I'll be using these pictures, and one of them is from Chaos Group. So first, the primary rays are shot from the camera through each pixel of the image plane to find out what part of the scene each pixel covers. When I say image plane, I mean this grid in front of the camera, which is called a internal frame buffer sometimes, where each square represents one single pixel. Now, keep this in mind. This is basically our final image, right? Now, I'm going to simplify this a bit and say that first, the primary or the camera rays, these red rays, are sent out from the camera into the scene for each individual pixel. And the first thing these rays do is to find out what is in the view. Now that we have this very basic information about what is going to be visible in the final render, we can start tracing secondary rays to analyze the exact color of each pixel. So the primary rays from the camera were to realize what will be visible in the scene, and the secondary rays are to give us the exact color of each pixel in the scene. So these rays include reflection rays, refraction rays, shadow rays, and so on. Now, because there are so many factors affecting the overall color value of a pixel, if you imagine a pixel belonging to a sphere, for example, in the scene, a color value for that pixel will be constructed from the light intensity, the direction of the light that's coming, the surface properties, whether it's shiny or matte or has transparent qualities or not, the camera angle we see that object from, and so many other things. I'm oversimplifying everything here and intentionally including some errors in technicalities to be able to explain the concept. But I have to, otherwise the only thing you would learn from this lesson is more confusion. So when a primary ray hits a point, a sample will be created. Now imagine there might be hundreds of samples per pixel. From each sample, we start tracing secondary rays. Which secondary rays will be traced depends on the surface property. So if the surface is not refractive, for example, there is no need for secondary refractive rays for that particular surface. Shadow rays are traced from each point or sample towards each light in the scene. If there is no obstacle between that point and the light, that point would be in direct illumination, and if there is something between that point and the light, it will be in shadows. For reflection rays, if the surface have specular reflective properties, secondary reflection rays will be shot into the scene to gather information about what should be reflected in this object. Secondary rays will be traced in a similar process for other effects like refraction, subsurface scattering, and other stuff. In order to avoid confusion, I'm not gonna get into detail about them right now. Now, these secondary rays will continue bouncing in the scene and gathering information about the scene until we have good enough samples to have a color value for each pixel. Basically, from averaging all the sample values, we can decide the final color value of the pixel. Now we can simply put those pixels together and have a final render or image. One of the purposes of image sampling in general is to improve anti-aliasing. As I mentioned, for each pixel we shot numerous amount of primary rays, and for each ray there would be a sample created. From those samples we send out secondary rays to gather information, and finally from averaging all the samples we get the final color value for that pixel. Now, this approach will allow us to avoid having jagged edges around our object and also in our texture that have a certain level of contrast and detail. Imagine if for each pixel we only had one sample, so only one primary ray. As there might be geometry detail or texture detail smaller than one pixel, only one sample per pixel wouldn't suffice, and the color value for that pixel would be probably wrong. To give us the smooth final result, image sampling not only averages the samples in one pixel, it also tries to take a look around that pixel and gather some information from neighboring samples, and based on that information, the final color value for that pixel will be determined. Now let me show you two renders with and without anti-aliasing. In the first render we have anti-aliasing in the scene. You can see the edges are smooth and we get a smooth final result. In the second render I have decreased the number of samples per pixel to only one, so we don't have any anti-aliasing. And I have done that simply by disabling max subdivisions in my image sampler settings and putting the minimum subdivision to 1. And also I've changed some other settings to make sure I can show you the exact result that I'm after. So in this image we don't have any anti-aliasing, there isn't any averaging of samples going on. That's why the final image is so rough and the edges are jagged. Let me zoom in around this leg here and compare the image with anti-aliasing and the one without it. In the one without anti-aliasing, you can see we have these rough, jagged edges, and the software doesn't try to somehow mix the white color of the leg and the blue colors of the wall. But in the render with anti-aliasing, you can see the software tries to adjust the color of the boundary pixels. So instead of pure white for these pixels, we get a combination of white and blue to make sure the edges would be smooth on the eyes. When we have these jagged edges, in this situation we say the image is aliased. Now we need to do something to counter this problem. We anti-alias by increasing the number of samples per pixel, and this is done by increasing the max subdiv number in our image sampler setting, and in this case bucket image sampler, which is the subject of discussion for our next lesson. So that's about ray tracing, image sampling, and anti-aliasing. I would suggest you go ahead and continue watching the rest of this section and then come back here and watch this introductory lesson again if you had any problem comprehending the subject. Also, if you want to dig deeper, there is a resource online, and there are other websites, but this one is in particular is really great. If you go to scratchapixel.com, you can find detailed lessons about all the fundamentals of computer graphics. Our subject was ray tracing, and there is a lesson here called an overview of ray tracing rendering technique. And here you can find tons of information about ray tracing and the mathematics and codes behind it. Perfect. See you in the next lesson. In this lesson, we start learning about different image sampling methods in V-Ray, which are bucket image sampler and progressive image sampler, and this video will be dedicated to bucket image sampler. For this lesson, we'll be using this scene, which has some nice texture and geometric details. Also, I have a hidden rug here, which we use it later on in the lesson. Let's open up our render setting and start setting up our image sampler. V-Ray tab is where you control all the image sampler related settings. So let's go to the image sampler or anti-aliasing rollout. What I want to do is to right click on this UI switcher and switch the entire interface to expert so we can see all the settings. First, you need to define the type of image sampler that you want to use. You have progressive image sampler, which progressively samples the entire image and refines the detail over time. And you have bucket image sampler, which takes a variable number of samples per pixel depending on the difference in the intensity of the pixels, what we talked about in the previous lesson basically. Based on the type of image sampler you choose, you get either bucket image sampler rollout or progressive image sampler rollout down here. In this case, let's set the sampler type to bucket and start explaining different options that you have in its specified rollout. Remember, in the previous lesson, I mentioned that each pixel would get tons of samples, right? We do that process adaptively. That means first we send a few samples to see how that pixel is looking. If those initial samples were having similar values or weren't contrasty enough, that would be great. We don't need more samples and we can read out the value for that pixel. But if those samples were having different values, when I say value, you can think of color, for example, and those values were contrasty enough, we would need more samples per pixel to have a reliable result. So we send more samples. Using min subdivs, max subdivs, and noise threshold values down here, we can control this adaptivity. First, we have min subdivs, which is the minimum or initial samples per pixel, and the real number is the square of the value here, so 8 means 64 samples per pixel. This value should stay at 1 always unless you have freakishly small detail in the scene. The max subdiv is the maximum number of samples per pixel. The noise threshold is the threshold which is used to determine if a pixel needs more sample. Right now, the noise threshold is set to 0.01. If initially we have 2 samples and the difference in their values were more than 0.01, that's an indication that we need more sample. How huge this difference is the main guideline for the software to use more samples between the minimum and maximum numbers. Then we have bucket width and bucket height, which are the maximum size of the render buckets. Now let's start taking a look at how the min and max subdivs and noise thresholds affect the quality of your render. First, let me quickly set up my GI and render elements. In the GI tab, let's set the primary engine to irradiance map and secondary to light cache. In the irradiance map, set the current preset to medium for now, set the subdivs to 70 and interp samples to 25 and light cache, I think it's fine. Now in the render elements tab, add denoiser, GI, lighting, reflection, refraction, and sample rate. Sample rate is a very useful render element that allows us to see how the min and max samples are being distributed, and we're going to be using a lot in this lesson. Now make sure V-Ray denoiser preset is set to mild as always. Also in the V-Ray tab and color mapping rollout, let's set the burn value to 0.15. We definitely talk about color mapping in a specific lesson. Now let me show you a few renders with different min and max subdivs and noise thresholds. In the first render, I have disabled max subdivs and therefore killing off any adaptivity, and the min subdiv was set to 1. That means in theory there would be 1 samples per pixel at least. As you can see, the result is extremely noisy, and also we have jagged edges from the lack of anti-aliasing. And if I check my sample rate pass, because there is no adaptivity, so the samples are distributed equally between the pixels. So it's pure black. There is no information to show here. Also, if I check out other passes like lighting and reflection, you can see they are as well very, very noisy. In the second render, min subdiv was set to 4 and max subdivs was off in this one too. Now each pixel receiving 16 samples, and as you can see, the noise is less noticeable. We have a respectable anti-aliasing going on, but again, there is no adaptivity here. Also, the render time has increased by 3.5 minutes. Also, we can take a look at the denoiser pass, and as you can see, this pass is getting rid of the remaining high frequency noises, but not quite perfectly. In the third render, max subdivs was set to 8 and still, min subdivs was set to 8 and still max subdivs was off. Now each pixel can have 64 samples per pixel. First of all, it took 23 minutes to render, but it's very, very clean as you can see. If I set this render as my B side and the previous render as my A side, you can see how cleaner this render is compared to our previous render. But the problem is there is no adaptivity. Some areas that might get cleaned up by using fewer samples, still using that 64 samples per pixel, therefore increasing our render time. From the next render, I introduced adaptivity. First, make sure to enable max subdivs, set the min subdivs to 1 and max subdivs to 4. And the noise threshold is to its default of 0.01. As you can see in the frame buffer, the render that we have is pretty noisy, but quite better compared to our first render, right? Now, if I check out my sample rate pass, we can see where the algorithm uses the min subdivs and where it uses the max subdivs. As you can see, we have 3 colors in this pass, 3 general colors, blue, green, and red. Where the image is blue, that means those areas are simple and just using minimum amount of samples, we have cleaned them up. The green parts are the areas where we have cleaned them up using the specified amount of samples, and they have reached the noise threshold value of 0.01, which is our specified noise threshold in the settings. So those areas are cool too. I mean, they have reached that noise threshold. If that noise threshold was higher, we would have get a noisy results, but they would have been green. But in the red parts, we have used all of the 16 samples per pixel, but still couldn't reach the noise threshold quality. That simply tells us that we need to increase the max subdiv number. If we stay in the sample rate channel and check out the next render, max subdiv number was set to 8 in this one, with the same noise threshold. And as you can see, we have successfully decreased the red parts, and that normally means less noise and higher quality renders. And if I go to the RGB pass, you can see it's a lot cleaner and more noise free compared to our previous render. In the next render, max subdivs was set to 16, and it is a bit cleaner compared to our previous render, but the render time did not increase that much, and that is because those extra samples only being used where need be. If I go to the sample rate pass, you can see compared to our previous render, the red parts are becoming more greenish and the green parts are becoming bluer. That means more parts are reaching the desired noise threshold value. But if I go to the RGB pass, you can see even though the sample rate pass is significantly different, but the overall quality of the render has not changed that much. In fact, it's a lot hard to see any difference. And the same thing is true if we take a look at the next render, in which max subdivs was set to 24. It's a bit cleaner compared to our previous render, and the sample rate pass is a lot bluer. That means most of the scene is reaching that specified noise threshold. As it is obvious from these renders, you cannot expect to only increase the max subdiv number and get more noise-free renders each time. in this render, for example, where the min subdivs is 1 and max is 24, most of the areas are reaching that noise threshold level without using all the 24 subdivs. So in order to make the render more noise free, we need to make the algorithm more sensitive to noise, and we do that simply by decreasing the noise threshold value. And when we do that, now we need to use more of the max subdiv samples to reach that particular noise threshold and therefore getting cleaner render. If I go to my render settings, let's make sure max subdivs is 24, and now let's decrease the noise threshold to 0.005. And let's take a look at the render. As you can see, it's a lot cleaner compared to our previous render with max subdiv set to 24 and noise threshold of 0.01. And we can compare these guys as A and B sides and see how better this one is getting. And as you can see, the new render is a lot cleaner because V-Ray is more sensitive and uses more samples. We can compare the two renders in the lighting and reflection passes as well, and obviously the new render is cleaner every single time. Now, in the sample rate pass, it looks like our previous render is bluer in general compared to the new render, but it doesn't necessarily mean cleaner render, right? The reason the previous render is bluer is because the noise threshold is higher and therefore less sensitive, and we can reach that noise threshold using less samples. But in the current render, noise threshold is lower and V-Ray is more sensitive, therefore it uses more samples out of that 24 max subdivs in more areas to reach that sensitivity level. Now, to make this issue more clear, in the next render, I have set the noise threshold to 0.1. Now the sample rate pass is almost completely blue, and it means V-Ray can reach that noise threshold by using less samples. That's why we don't have any noticeable red part, which represents the max subdiv number. And if I take a look at the RGB pass, as you can see, it's very, very noisy, even though we have the same max subdiv number as our previous render. But because the noise threshold is higher, it doesn't use 24 subdivs. In fact, it doesn't get close to this number, and in most parts, probably a max subdiv of 4 will be enough to get to that high noise threshold level. Now, let me load the render with max subdiv set to 24 and noise threshold set to 0.005. I also have another render in which the max subdivs was set to 50 with the noise threshold of 0.01. And as you can see, the render with max subdivs of 24 and noise threshold of 0.005 is cleaner compared to this one. The same thing is happening here, even though the max subdivs is higher. Because the noise threshold is also higher, V-Ray wouldn't use all the max subdivs. And if we take a look at the sample rate pass, we have a very blue pass where mostly min subdivs are used. When I say min subdivs here, it doesn't necessarily mean 1, because any number between 1 and 50 subdivs can be used in this render. Where it's pure blue, we are using min subdivs number. In these dimmer green areas, we are using bigger numbers than the min subdivs, but still closer to the min subdivs compared to the max subdivs. In the brighter green areas, we are using subdivs closer to max subdivs, and in the red areas, we are obviously using the max subdivs. So as this scene is mostly blue, it means we haven't used the max subdivs number or anything close to it that much. If we don't have any noise in the final render, that's okay, but in this case, we do have noise and therefore forced to decrease the noise threshold value to get more noise-free renders. Okay, let me set the max subdivs to 24 and noise threshold to 0.01. It seems confusing, but I invite you to rewind and watch this lesson and this section a few times because it's not an easy subject and you really need to watch these videos a few times to grasp the concept fully. I also want to talk about mean shading rates and divide shading subdivs in this lesson. Now, if you remember from our previous section, any light has a subdivs parameter to control its quality. So if I select any of the lights in the scene, you can see in its sampling rollout we have a subdivs option. The same thing is true for materials and other effects in the program. These subdivs values are working and affecting the scene in conjunction with the subdivs values in the image sampler rollout. We can say that V-Ray needs two types of samples. We have image samples that relate to the pixel values and composing the final image. And we have shading samples for computing effects like glossy reflection and refractions, global illumination, area shadows, and other blurry effects. We can call the first kind of samples our primary samples and second type our secondary samples. The way it works, we can prioritize our primary samples over our secondary samples. That means I can set up my render settings in a way that allows me to let my primary samples take over the render and control the sampling of everything in the render. And that is done by increasing the max subdivs number in the image sampler rollout and decreasing the noise threshold. But normally it leads to higher render times. What you want to do is to balance between your primary and secondary samples. The option responsible to control that balance is mean shading rate. In this new release of V-Ray, V-Ray 3, basically all the subdivs in the lights and materials are controlled automatically by V-Ray using this mean shading rate. It basically balances between the samples that you have in your image sampling rollout and how many samples to be used in your shading effects. And as I mentioned, this option is responsible to control that balance is mean shading rate. This option controls the number of rays shot for image samples or anti-aliasing versus rays for shading samples like blurry effects, including lights with area shadows, blurry or glossy reflections and refractions, GI, and so on. Increasing this value means less time will be spent on anti-aliasing or image samples and more time on shading samples. Now let's take a look at a few renders with different mean shading rates. To increase the speed of this lesson, I've just rendered a portion of the image. The first render has the shading rate of 1. So for each anti-aliasing ray, there would be 1 shading ray. In the second render, mean shading rate was set to 3. So for each anti-aliasing ray, 3 shading rays. Basically, more effort will be put into the lights and materials and GI, etc. The next render, it was set to 6. Then 10. Then 16. 64. And 256. Each time we increase mean shading rate, we focus more on our secondary rays compared to our primary rays. From a certain point, you can see the render time increases, and in this case, from the mean shading rate of 10 upwards, the render time has increased. Now, if I compare the mean shading rate of 3 to 256, you can see the version with higher mean shading rate is clearly cleaner, but also the render time is much higher. And we can probably get a cleaner render with something like the default value of 6 and instead decreasing the noise threshold value. In most cases, you don't need to change this value at all. Next, we have divide shading subdivs. Shading subdivs here is the subdivs for lights, materials, GI, etc. Earlier in this lesson, you remember I saying that the image samples and shading samples work together. The way they relate to each other is like this. Let's select the light number 3, and as you can see in its sampling rollout, its grayed out subdivision is set to 64. As we know, the actual number of samples is the square of this value, so 64 by 64 equals 4096. And our max subdivs is 24, so 24 by 24 equals 576. The real number of shadow rays for this light will be 4096 by 576, which equals to 2359296, right? That's a lot of samples, 2,359,296 samples per pixel. We can actually see these numbers here in the DMC calculator. To do so in the global DMC rollout, enable use local subdivs. Now, if the divide shading rate is enabled, it reverses this behavior from multiplication to division. For the time being, let me just disable divide shading rate and see those numbers that I just mentioned. As you can see with the current settings, we are going to have a minimum of 615 shadow rays and a maximum of 2,359,296 shadow rays per pixel. But when divide shading rate is on, the number of shading samples will be divided by the number of image samples. So in this case, the subdivs is 64. The actual samples are the square of this value, so 4096. The max image subdivs is 24, so the samples are 24 by 24 equals 576. Now we simply divide 4096 by 576, the result is 7.1. And as you can see in the built-in calculator here, we get at least 8 shadow rays per pixel, and we can go up to 4096 samples. The reason this option exists, divide shading rate, is when we actually increase our image samples, the shading samples can be decreased. And as the image samples can take over everything, if the settings are high enough, we wouldn't need to calculate all that extra shading samples. Now let me show you two renders with and without divide shading subdivs. Now remember that I have high subdiv value for my lights and materials in the scene, and because use local subdivs is enabled, we will use these subdivs instead of automatically determining their subdivs based on the mean shading rate value. In the first render, divide shading subdivs is on and the render time is 6 minutes. And in the second render, it is off and the render time is almost 45 minutes. But obviously, as we are using a much higher shading samples, the render is a lot cleaner compared to the previous results. We have talked about a lot of things in this lesson and it might be confusing. So let's close the frame buffer and get back to our render settings. In most cases, you really don't need to alter mean shading rate or divide shading subdivs. So let's make sure they are 6 and enabled respectively. Also, in the global DMC controls, let's disable use local subdivs and let the viewer decide the number of shading or local subdivs, obviously based on the mean shading rate value. Most of the time, you can get extremely good results by only tweaking min subdivs, max subdivs, and noise threshold values. So if you are not that much into tweaking to get perfectly optimized results, these 3 parameters are enough to control all the important aspects of your render. So for this image and based on all of that experience we had with this scene, for the final render, I'm gonna set the mean subdivs to 1, max subdivs to 24 or 32 here in this case, and noise threshold to 0.005. And all the other image sampler settings are set to their default values. The local subdivs of the lights and materials also won't be used, as we let viewer to select proper subdivs for them based on the mean shading rate value. I mentioned we have also a rug in the scene. I'm gonna render 2 versions, one with and one without the rug. Also in the comment tab, I'm gonna increase the width and height to 1400. In the GI tab, I'm gonna set the irradiance map subdivs to 85. And in the frame buffer, let's make sure region render is disabled and start rendering the scene. I'm just gonna go ahead and show you the results at the frame buffer. This is our first render with the rug, and as you can see, it's pretty clean and it took about an hour to render. And the second render without the rug, and this one took 30 minutes to render. If I zoom in, you can see we have a pretty clean render. There are still some noise, but not that noticeable, and we can get rid of them. If we take a look at the denoiser path, you can see it's absolutely perfect. Now let's quickly do some color correction. Just enable the white balance and set the temperature to something like 7600 or something like that to warm up the render a bit. Also, if you want, you can add a bit more contrast in the curve corrections, but in this case, I'm just gonna go ahead and leave it like that for you. And let's make sure we are in the denoiser pass. Let's zoom in and enjoy our two renders. So that's about bucket image sampler. I will see you in the next lesson for progressive image sampler, which is going to be a short and sweet lesson. See you there. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the progressive image sampler. Progressive image sampler is very similar to bucket image sampler, but instead of rendering the image in buckets, it renders the entire image progressively in passes. The main advantage of using progressive image sampler is going to be having a fast feedback. So instead of having to wait for all the buckets to render, you can see your entire image immediately after pressing the render button. Of course, if you have Irradiance Map or Light Cache as your secondary or primary GI engines, V-Ray first needs to calculate those before starting to progressively refine the entire image over time. We'll be using the same scene from our previous lesson. In the V-Ray tab, let's make sure our image sampler is set to progressive. Now let's come down to our progressive image sampler rollout. As you can see, we have our min subdivs, max subdivs, and noise thresholds, and they function exactly like in the bucket image sampler rollout. We have two new parameters, render time and ray bundle size. Render time is the maximum render time in minutes. Right now the render time is set to 0.5, so the render will stop after half a minute. And this time does not include any GI calculation. So if you are using Irradiance Map and Light Cache as your GI engines and the calculation of those takes, let's say 4 minutes, this half minutes begins after the GI has finished calculating. Obviously, something like brute force does not need any pre-pass calculation. If you are only using brute force as your GI engines, your final progressive render starts immediately and stops after half a minute. Also, you can set the render time to 0, and this way the render won't be limited to time and it will continue until either you stop it manually or the defined max subdivs and noise thresholds has reached. In the GI tab, I have Irradiance Map as my primary engine and Light Cache as my secondary engine. To increase the speed, let me set Irradiance Map preset to low and subdivs to 50. And interpolation samples to 20 and set the Light Cache subdivs to 500. Now let's get back to the V-Ray tab and we can start the render with the default image sampler settings. As you can see, first the Irradiance Map and the Light Cache will be calculated, and after that the image will be rendered for half a minute. As you can see, immediately after the GI calculation, we can see our entire image being progressively refined over half a minute. At first, the image is very noisy, but we can see the entire image and get a very good idea of the overall look and lighting of the scene. And then as it goes through, it kind of refines the image progressively until that half a minute reaches, and then it will stop the render. Now let's get back to the GI tab and set the Irradiance Map preset to medium, subdivs to 75, and interpolation samples to 25. I've already saved out the irradiance map in the render output folder for this lesson, so let's change the irradiance map mode to from file, and in the render output folder of this lesson you can find the irradiance map, or you can save and use your own map. Also, for the light cache, let's set the subdivs to 1000, change the mode to from file, and in the same folder you can find the light cache map based on these settings. Perfect. Now, if we render the scene, we don't need to calculate GI first, and it will render the final image immediately. In the progressive image sampler rollout, let's set the render time to 0, and now the render will stop only when we stop it manually or if the max subdivs and the noise threshold is reached. So let's start the render. Now immediately we start progressively rendering the final image, and it gets cleaner and cleaner by the time. You can see after a few minutes it gets very, very clean, and we didn't have to wait for all the buckets to come in and render our scene. Now I can go ahead and stop the render if I wanted to, and whenever I want, and be happy with it. One of the issues with the progressive image sampler is the RAM usage, especially if you have render elements added to your render, because the entire image data is always kept in memory while rendering. It's going to need more RAM compared to bucket image sampler, right? Also, when using distributed rendering, because we constantly refine the image, the communication between the client and the servers is a lot, and that might lead to less than optimized CPU utilization on the render slaves. This problem can be controlled using ray bundle size parameter and mean shading rate value. Basically, higher values for ray bundle size makes the chunk of work done by each machine bigger, and therefore optimizing CPU utilization a bit better. Also, if I quote Chaos Group website, in contrast with the bucket image sampler, the progressive image sampler doesn't have a mechanism to recover if a DR server goes offline during rendering before sending back the results from its calculations. The render progress might hang indefinitely waiting for the missing data to arrive. This will be corrected in a future release. End of the quote. The question here is which image sampler is better for which situation. For final renders, I barely use progressive sampler. Progressive sampler is amazing for fast feedbacks. When you start working on a project and you want to see how your light and shaders look in the scene and you don't want to wait all the time, using progressive image sampler is very, very useful in those situations. Obviously, you have V-Ray RT, which we have used a few times in the course, and we'll be learning more about it later on. But sometimes the scene is a bit more complex. You might not have the resources to see the changes in real time using V-Ray RT. In those cases, progressive rendering can be very, very helpful. Also, sometimes when you want to render an animation and only spend a defined amount of time per frame to render, you can use progressive image sampler and set your desired time as your render time. Bucket rendering is preferred when using distributed rendering, as it can reduce the network traffic and prevent possible loss of information that we discussed when using progressive image sampler. So in this lesson, we learned about progressive image sampler and compared it to bucket image sampler. In the next lesson, we discuss global DMC options. In this lesson, we take a look at the options in the global DMC rollout. If you have used V-Ray in previous versions, you might remember how much time we used to spend here to try and optimize our image sampling. But with V-Ray 3, and especially the third service pack of this release, which changed the way V-Ray used to sample the scene and improve upon it significantly, the parameters in the global DMC rollout are barely touched in a production workflow. DMC stands for Deterministic Monte Carlo, which is a method for calculating blurry values like area shadows, glossy reflections, depth of field, and so on. As we discuss sampling and how V-Ray does it in quite a lot of details, we can go ahead and start explaining the parameters in this rollout. First, we have lock noise pattern. When enabled, the sampling pattern will be the same from frame to frame in an animation. And sometimes this is really not good. By that I mean, if you render your animation and don't have very high quality sampling settings and have this option on, you can clearly see the animation is floating underneath a stationary noise, which is really obvious and bad. But sometimes you might want this option on. In general, you don't have to touch this option and it can be disabled. Next, we have use local subdivs, which we discussed in our previous lessons. When disabled, V-Ray automatically determines the subdivs for lights, materials, and other shading samples based on the mean shading rate value. But when enabled, the actual subdiv values from the scene will be used. When use local subdivs is enabled, we get another parameter called subdivs multiplier, and this is going to multiply all the subdivs in the scene by the number you specify here. This multiplier affects all the subdivs values in the scene except for the image sampler subdivs, light cache subdivs, caustic subdivs, and photon map subdivs. Now, if you for whatever reason don't like the new sampling workflow and like to manually tweak all the subdivs in the scene, you can simply turn on use local subdivs, set mean shading rate to 1, and disable divide shading subdivs. After that, you simply go ahead and check out your lighting render elements, and if there was any noise, you can simply increase the light subdivs. If the reflections were noisy in the reflection render elements or in the RGB paths, you can decrease the material subdivs until you get your desired quality. Increase the material subdivs until you get your desired quality, which normally leads to very long render times, and I don't recommend doing so. On the right side of the rollout, we have mean samples, adaptive amount, and a secondary noise threshold. Next, we have mean sample. If you remember in the previous discussions, I mentioned that for image sampling, first we send a few initial samples, and if the values of those samples were close enough, we wouldn't need more samples to send. And if the contrast was big enough, we would send more samples. And mean samples determines the absolute minimum of samples that must be used before stop sending those samples. Honestly, in most cases, this option doesn't affect your render that much and you don't need to alter it at all. Let me show you a few renders with different mean samples value. First, let's go ahead and make sure mean shading rate is set to 6, divide shading subdivs is enabled, and use local subdivs is disabled. As you can see, I have 4 renders with mean sample set to 2, 16, 128, and 256. As it's obvious, the render time is pretty much the same. There isn't any noticeable difference between the quality of the renders, and that's mostly is one of the welcome side effects of the new improved sampling algorithm. So as you can see, you really don't need to alter this value in most cases. Let's make sure mean sample is set to its default of 16. Next, we have adaptive amount, which controls 2 things. First, how much the number of samples depends on the importance of a blurry value. For example, a bright glossy reflection is more important and needs more sample in comparison to a dim glossy reflection. Also, it affects the mean number of samples to be used. 1 basically means full adaptivity and 0 means no adaptivity. In theory, 1 means V-Ray can have no mean samples or mandatory samples, and 0 means all the defined samples need to be used. Let's take a look at a few renders. In the first render, the adaptive amount was set to 1. The next one is 0.85, which is the default number. Then we have 0.7, 0.5, 0.1, and 0. As we go from 1 to 0, you can see the noise becomes cleaner and the render time increases. So if I compare the version with adaptivity set to 1 and the one with 0, you can see the 0 version is cleaner because V-Ray is forced to use more samples and be less adaptive. Normally the default value is good enough and you don't need to adjust it that much. Now down here we have a secondary noise threshold which, if I quote Chaos Group website, controls V-Ray's judgment of when a shading value is good enough to be used, end of quote. Honestly, this noise threshold is not going to do much in this new improved sampling workflow, so you can leave it alone. That's about global DMC controls. In the next lesson we are going to take a look at the image filter rollout. See you there. In this lesson, we take a look at the image filter rollout. We know image sampling gives us the final color value for each pixel. Image filter, on the other hand, sharpens or blurs the transition between adjacent pixel colors. Sometimes when you have very fine details in your geometry or textures, you can use image filter to make that detail more obvious and prominent. Or if you are rendering an animation, for example, and you know that very fine detail might lead to artifacts and flickering in your animation, you can blur those details using image filters. Now, let's go to the V-Ray tab and open up our image filter rollout. First, you can enable and disable image filter, and on the right side, you can specify the filter type. As I mentioned, some of these filters tend to blur the final result and some of them tend to sharpen it. The default filter is V-Ray Lanczos filter and it tends to blur the final results a bit. How much it blurs it depends on the size parameter down here. And other filter types also have some of this, size or something similar to control their function. Some of the filters like Area, Soften, Lanczos are blurring filter, and some like Catmull ROM and Mitchell-Netter Valley are sharpening filters. Let's take a look at a few render. In case you want to work with the scene, I have both Irradiance map and Light Cache mode set to From File, and you can find the maps in the render output folder for this lesson. In the first render, image filtering is disabled. In the second render, V-Ray Lanczos filter was used. And as you can see, it's blurrier compared to our previous render. In the third render, I used Area filter and set the size to 3 to increase the blurring effect. And as you can see, it's quite more blurry compared to our previous renders. And finally, I used Catmull ROM, which is a sharpening filter. And if I compare it with when we had no image filter or the default Lanczos filter, you can see it's a lot sharper and makes the final details more prominent. You might think you can simply disable image filtering and blur or sharpen your final render in Photoshop, for example, but here the filter is applied on a sub-pixel level and the result would be much more accurate compared to just adjusting your image in post. So that was a very quick lesson about image filtering. I will see you in the next lesson where we talk about render mask. In this lesson, we'll be talking about render mask. For this lesson, I'll be using the same scene from the lesson which we discussed, Bucket Image Sampler, which was the second lesson of this section. So let's open up our render settings and start discussing render mask. As always, set your UI switcher to expert so we can see all the options, even though we don't need to do that in this case. Render mask allows you to determine which pixel of the image you would like to be rendered based on the different criteria that you can define. By default, it's set to none, so everything will be rendered. Next we have texture. When set to texture, you can define a black and white map. The black pixels won't be rendered and anything other than black will be rendered. In order to define a texture, click on this None button. Choose Bitmap. And let's select BW29 as our map. Before rendering the scene, let's go to the GI tab and make sure Brute Force is the primary and secondary GI engine. Get back to the V-Ray tab and render the scene. As you can see, the texture has been used as a mask and only the pixels other than black are rendered. Next we have selected. In this mode, only currently selected objects are rendered. This mode is very useful. Imagine you are working on a shader for a specific object and you would like to isolate and only render that particular object. In this situation, this mode can be very useful. Even though you would only render that object, but V-Ray still calculates the entire scene and you can see the effects of other objects on your selected object. Or if you want to re-render an object without changing anything else, this selected mode can be the solution. Okay, let me first clear the current frame buffer. And let's select the desk here and render the scene. And as you can see, only the desk is being rendered, but we still can see the effect of the rest of the scene on our desk. Let me clear the frame buffer again. Next we have include exclude, which lets you make a list of all the objects you want to be rendered. So if I click on this include button, I can select a few objects here, add them to the include list, and now if I press render, only those objects will be rendered. Now let's clear our frame buffer again. We have layers, which only renders objects that belong to the currently selected layer, and object IDs, which renders only objects with specified object IDs. So if I select this lamp, for example, here, and let's right click on it and select object properties, and we can set the 4 as its object ID and press OK, and then put 4 in the object IDs here and press render. Only the objects with object ID of 4 will be in the render. So that's about render mask. We are done with image sampling and I will see you in the next section.